Welcome, everyone. Assalamu alaikum. This is another edition of our Dance TV English language version show. And as always, we try to get some of the most powerful and outstanding voices throughout the world. Some of them very close and near to me, that over the years that have inspired me in both my intellectual work and my social justice activism. And today I have someone incredibly special, who I just, on a personal note, I met in 2003. She will, of course, never remember these things because she's so famous, and she goes all over the world and meets millions of people. But who I met in 2003 at the World Social Forum in Porto Alegre, and I had
Mm.
not known much about her that before then. I had known somewhat, but I was just absolutely riveted by her speech that she gave there. I mean, it was right before the Iraq War, and this kind of gives you a sense of the kind of activism and the work that she was involved in against the sanctions on Iraq throughout the 1990s that was devastating that society. The Palestine Solidarity Movement, a whole array of social justice movements, but I can't even remember what the exact subject of the talk was. I'm sure that the looming Iraq War was part of it, but it was just so powerfully articulated that I just fell in love with this person. That so since that time, I really have read our guest's work, and let me actually introduce her name. And she is Dr. Rania Masri. And she, I mean, her work in terms of her public speaking, her writing, her book chapters, her articles, they are some of the most powerful, scathing, sharpest, no nonsense critiques of what has been going on, say, in the Middle East, the ecological crises that we're facing. And that's always intrigued me about Rania, is that her background is very much in kind of ecology, environmental forestry, and so on. But I have rarely met a sharper political mind with such political acumen than Dr. Rania Masri. So I can go on and on about her, but we have limited time, so I don't want to take too much of that time. But I do want to very warmly welcome you, Dr. Rania Masri, to the program.
Truly, thank you for that extraordinarily humbling introduction, truly. And I must confess, I have a weak memory. I've had it all my life, so I have difficulty remembering anyone or any name or most things. So that's the real reason. But truly, thank you. Thank you very, very much for that extraordinarily humbling introduction. Truly, thank you.
You're most welcome, and it's well deserved. And of course, I wouldn't blame you on that occasion, because I was literally amongst thousands, hundreds of thousands of people listening to you. So, anyways, Dr. Rania, we wanted to speak about several issues that right now, for particularly, I mean, the broader West Asian region, if you can call it, both MENA and the West Asian region, including here in Pakistan as well, that many people are very concerned about. Many people are not fully aware of what is going on in terms of the larger kind of geopolitical machinations of these, whether it's the Gulf regimes and the United States, and of course at the centrally in the Middle East, the state of Israel. But before we get to that, I did want to go to the issue of specifically Lebanon, the country that I believe you are in right now.
Yes.
Right. Yes. And of course, we all heard about the massive explosion that took place there, and we're very, I mean, confused. Where did this come from? Was this something that had happened, some local kind of mishap that had happened, or something happening from abroad? And just on a very personal note, I mean, beyond the giving us kind of the context of that particular incident and what it has reflected about Lebanese society. Um, my parents were in Beirut. My late father, was at the American University of Beirut from the late '60s to the early '70s, and of course, I think, and at that time, again, the cliche, the Paris of the Middle East, of Beirut, um, and of course, at that time, maybe there was some truth to that, but and of course, they left right before the civil war broke out in Lebanon. But I think there is not a level of awareness of Lebanon, so that even today we still think of it as, oh well, it's the Paris of the Middle East. I don't know why, but anyways, so I think some reflections of yours on kind of really, I mean, I think the kind of civil wars, the role of Israel in Lebanon, and also specifically this the incident that happened with the massive explosion in Lebanon. So, would welcome reflections.
Well, thank you. I'm going to start with the phrase that you presented, which is a common phrase that we've all heard, the Paris of the Middle East. And I think for many of us from this region, let me speak specifically. I personally find that phrase to be quite problematic, because just like comparing us to Europe, we also have this phrase, the Middle East. We who are of this region are neither middle nor east of anyone. We are of this region. So we could call ourselves from Southwest Asia. We could call ourselves from the Mediterranean, from the Arab region, from the Levant. But our identity is not in reference to others. And yet this is what the term Paris of the Middle East is. And this is actually the way that Europeans in general tend to look at all of us. All of us from the global south, we're all examined through their lens. And then we accept their perception of who we are, and we judge ourselves by how they see us. So I think the first cloak of liberation is to identify ourselves by how we are and how we need to be. And therein arises the problem. So if we look at August 4th, this explosion that happened, it's going to be almost 2 months. An explosion that, yes, a lot of people are asking, what was the initial cause? So a little bit of background. We had approximately 2,750 tons of ammonium nitrate improperly stored along our main port, Beirut, our main port, okay? It was improperly stored for more than a decade. And we know this from the paperwork, okay? And then an explosion happened because of a fire that was initiated on August 4th. That explosion led to 300,000 people becoming homeless, led to more than 6,000 people injured, and led to the deaths of more than 200 individuals, okay, including Lebanese, Syrians, Palestinians, Bangladeshis, a range of working class individuals, led to the destruction of more than 20% of our capital. A lot of people are asking, well, what caused the explosion? Was it an Israeli attack? Was it CIA? Was it this? Was it that? And we can have analyses and conspiracy theories, and many times conspiracy theories are accurate. However, I think what's necessary is for us to understand where our political leaders in Lebanon over the past several governments and over all the administrations. So from those responsible to the ports, to those responsible in the Lebanese army, to those responsible in the courts, to those responsible in the ministries, etc., all these range of governmental authorities, did they know of the improper storage of ammonium nitrate? And the answer is yes, unequivocally yes. So for us, for me specifically, it's irrelevant actually whether the Israelis caused the spark, whether the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States caused the spark, or whether it actually was caused by welding improperly in the storage of fireworks, which is the official story, okay? It's irrelevant. For me, there is political responsibility to the improper storage of a sleeping bomb. And the sleeping bomb actually caused one of the largest explosions in world history, okay? The same causes of the August 4th explosion, by the way, and there's been no real investigation. It's been almost 2 months. We still don't know. There's been really no real accountability. All the political parties in this country, all the sectarian political parties that were in government or remain in government, all of them shed responsibility and place it on someone else, without exception.
So you mean
For us,
there's been no international investigation like the Rafiq Hariri assassination?
but okay, do we want an international investigation?
Right.
I mean, even if we're going to look at that Hariri international investigation, we know very well that people do not come from outside to conduct neutral investigations.
Yes.
I mean, can you imagine the absurdity? The Lebanese government has allowed the US Federal Bureau of Investigation to be present in Lebanon and to investigate the August 4th explosion. Now, anyone who knows a shred of United States history knows the involvement of the US FBI in fabricating information and in assassinating individuals, starting from the Black Panther Party onwards. So do you invite the fox to investigate the chicken coop? You know, this is the equivalence of allowing the FBI in Lebanon. So there's been no real national investigation. And of course, let us not expect that an international investigation would be neutral or would even be honest. Okay? But for us politically, those of us who strive to live with a semblance of dignity, for us to look at the August 4th explosion and to say, well, it was just bad luck. Of course, we reject this. Okay? It was completely the responsibility of the political leadership. They are criminally negligent. If they knew, they are responsible. And if they did not know, they are responsible for their ignorance. The same problem of August 4th is the problem of our economic bankruptcy. Since 2019, we have been a country that has bankrupt. Our currency has lost more than 70% of its value. We have hyperinflation in the country where many of our basic goods have increased more than 300 and 400% in their cost. We have unemployment at greater than 50% unemployment in the country, and there's no end in sight. And this bankruptcy did not just befall the country like a hurricane. This bankruptcy was foretold years ago. This bankruptcy was to be expected because of the banking system that all the sectarian political parties agreed to, and because of the creation of an economy that is 100% dependent on consumption. We are a country that produces almost nothing. So it's the same system that has allowed for this bankruptcy, that has allowed for the explosion. And therein arises the larger question: what is the system that has caused this level of economic and social and physical destruction in the country, so that we can identify the problem, so that we can then work towards a solution?
No, absolutely. That's a great introduction to the kind of the pressing issues that are happening immediately within Lebanon. One of the things that I wanted to ask you, because again, the lack of awareness of kind of, we know here in Pakistan and many other Muslim societies as well, for example, the role of many of the Gulf regimes, and particularly Saudi Arabia, in terms of influence in whether it's in the media or in political culture and so on and so forth. And from my own understanding, Lebanon seems quite similar in that regard. You know, I've had discussions with our good friend Asad Abu Khalil about these things, and it's just so I mean, shocking to us how similar the type of infiltration that and influence that the House of Saud wants to kind of have in these societies. So speaking about both that as well as how, and I know that this is kind of a little bit going into a little bit of the history. It's just because I do want our listeners to kind of have some sense of kind of what has happened, what has led to kind of Lebanon being kind of this, the whole kind of sectarian strife, and so on and so forth. So just in terms of two things I'd like you to focus on. One is, yes, as I said, the Saudi influence, but the other is the Israeli factor, and what has emerged within the Lebanese body politique, whether it's from the government itself response, whatever government it is, whatever sectarian orientation or political orientation, or non-governmental forces. So if you could speak a little bit about that, we would really be pleased. Yeah.
Well, you've given me lots of questions. So if you don't mind, my answer is going to be quite long. Okay.
Take your time.
Yes, most definitely. The Saudi Arabian government has been involved in Lebanon for decades. And they have very direct involvement in our choice of prime minister. They have very direct involvement in many things within our domestic affairs, let alone our foreign affairs. But they are not the only government that is involved domestically in Lebanon. We also have Iran's involvement, we have Turkey's involvement, we have France's involvement, and of course, we have the United States involvement.
No.
So then the larger question is, what kind of a system do we have in Lebanon that allows for these countries to be involved in the choice of our prime minister, to be involved in the choice of our president? You know, before the war on Syria, we had an SS. We used to call it an SS involvement. Saudi Arabia and Syria. We had to agree that the SS were in agreement. And once Syria and Saudi Arabia were in agreement, then we would have a prime minister. And this was discussed so openly. So what was basically openly discussed is we do not have any self-rule. We do not have any political system that is immune to foreign involvement. Okay, so why is that? Why is that the political system that we have in Lebanon is so open to foreign involvement from across the political spheres and is dependent on foreign agreements for us to function with a semblance of functionality? Okay, and therein goes back to the same issue that I brought up earlier. Who are we? You know, so we were the Paris of the Middle East, but who are we? The French, when they decided to build these borders of Lebanon, which they constructed, you know, 100 years ago, they decided to build them particularly so we can have a Maronite majority. So they already came to this region not viewing us as Lebanese, not viewing us as Syrians, not viewing us as people of the land, but seeking to divide us and to conquer us through that division. Okay, so therein became the system that we are 18 sects living together. We are this magnificent representation of religious diversity. And how can we ensure that these 18 communities will not kill each other and we will preserve their coexistence? So we will come up with this political sectarian system. All of this narrative is historical rubbish. It is historical rubbish, because this idea that the way an individual chooses to worship God becomes the way one is represented in government is the very contradiction to democracy. It is the exact contradiction to democracy, and it is the exact contradiction to the idea of a community. Okay? So you want to destroy communities, you want to destroy democratic representation, deny me my freedom, and force me to be represented according to the religion into which I was born. It becomes very similar to the caste system in India. Very similar to that. The only way I can get out of the religion into which I was born, which has nothing to do with one's faith, by the way, okay, is by going into another one. So I have to take off one caste to wear another caste, okay? So it is this political sectarian system that by design breeds corruption, by design breeds clientelism, by design allows for this level of incompetence that we saw with the explosion, okay? And by design creates an internal stalemate, thereby creating sectarian leaderships who are beholden to foreign interest. Okay, so we speak about what do the Maronites want, what do the Shia want, what do the Sunni want, as if one's religious identity determines one's political thoughts. We don't say, what do the farmers want? What do the teachers want? What do the refugees want? What do the poor, the rich want, the bankers want? We are not identified in that way. What do the socialists of the country want, or the capitalists of the country want? No. Our political identity becomes eradicated. And instead we have this nonsense called a political sectarian system. This is the problem. And yet this is the very system that the French love, of course, because they built it, and that the Americans love. Absolutely, the US government loves this. This is the very model of government that is then taken to Libya, is then taken to Iraq, is then taken to Syria, and presented as the model of coexistence. When it is the contradiction to it. Because even the concept that I am coexisting with my fellow citizen, I am coexisting with my neighbor, makes it as if my neighbor becomes an other, as if my neighbor is a foreigner. But we're Lebanese. I don't coexist with Lebanese. You don't coexist with Pakistanis. You exist together. You disagree, but you exist together. So herein lies the critical problem. is this sectarian system. And it is because we have the makeup that we have in Lebanon, that the only way that we can walk out of the sectarian system is by developing a civil state, one in which our religious identity goes back to being sacred and goes back to being personal, and in which we actually elect political parties that have ideologies,
Right.
that have principles, that have values, that don't seek to represent this nonsense called sectarian communities. Okay.
Right.
By doing that, by recognizing that we can only exist as a civil state, that means automatically we recognize that Israel becomes our enemy. Okay, and this is really critically important.
Why is that so? Why is that so?
Okay, because if I'm going to tell you Israel is our enemy as Lebanese, because since 1948, Israel has been committing massacres against us, which is true. They committed the first massacre against Lebanese in 1948 with the Hula massacre, and they've been attacking us rather consistently ever since, until 2006, when Hezbollah proved itself to be a military defense. And since 2006, Israel has been threatening to attack, invading our airspace and our water space and threatening to attack. So if I'm going to tell you I am enemies with Israel because of its past massacres against us, you will tell me that can be solved. We'll have a peace agreement and they won't attack you anymore.
Right.
If I'm going to tell you that I am enemies with Israel because Israel occupies a portion of Lebanese land that it continues to occupy, which are the Shab'a farms, you will tell me have a peace agreement and they will withdraw and it will be fine.
Yeah.
If I'm going to tell you that I believe that Palestine is part of my identity and part of my land, and Israel occupies Palestine and therefore occupies my land, and until that occupation is liberated, I cannot be at peace with this entity, you will tell me that you do not consider Palestine to be part of your land because you accept the idea that Lebanon is a complete country as stated in our constitution. And so then that point is mute. Okay, because we are a country comprised of individuals that carry different identities. Some of us consider ourselves only to be Lebanese. I consider myself to be a Lebanese from Syria because I consider Lebanon to be part of Greater Syria. Okay, yes. But this becomes secondary. The real reason we are enemies with Israel, and this is critical, is because for us to exist in Lebanon as a state, one that is not hostage to foreign interest, one that is not comprised of leaders that by design are incompetent and will continue to give us only bankruptcies and explosions, and continue to rely on Saudi Arabia, Iran, Turkey, the United States, France, to decide who will be our prime minister. For us to be a state means we have to be a civil state. By being a civil state, one whose identity is not tied to our religion, thereby having a Jewish settler state, apartheid state next door to us becomes an existential threat to us. The mere fact that Israel continues to be a racist, apartheid, settler state entity makes it an existential threat to us as Lebanese, irrespective of any peace agreement that the United Arab Emirates, this nonsense of a peace agreement between the UAE and Bahrain that they make with them, irrespective of any surrender agreement between Jordan, the Palestinian Authority, and Egypt, and irrespective of what happens, for us as Lebanese, if we want to exist as a dignified country, we cannot coexist with a racist settler state government like Israel. We simply cannot. And Israel has shown that through its interventions in Iraq, through its interventions in Syria, through its interventions worldwide,
Absolutely.
through its marriage of values with apartheid South Africa, through right now its strong relationship with the Indian government, and we see what Modi is doing in India, and we can go on and on and on.
Absolutely.
We see the values that the Israeli government commits to, okay, and these values are built on a racist sectarian identity.
Absolutely.
So therefore, they will continue to want to impose this racist viewpoint throughout the region, or will want to make us into dictatorships like in the Gulf, like in Jordan, like in Egypt. If we want to exist as a democratic country, Israel is an enemy. If we want to make peace with Israel, then we will not exist.
Yes.
Then we will be beggars and we will accept the crumbs from the outside. That is the choice. That is simply the choice. Okay.
No, this
so
and in fact
that becomes
yes, absolutely. This point that you make, I mean, in fact, the wonderful kind of history that you gave us of kind of and which Lebanon represents the extreme example of kind of this sectarianization, the divide and conquer policy of the colonial powers, which of course it has it did all over, including in the subcontinent and in the Indian subcontinent as well. Lebanon certainly represents the extreme of that, and I'm glad that now you pointed out of these, I mean, horrible, ludicrous kind of agreements now going on, the UAE normalization and the Bahrain normalization, all of this, which points to exactly what you're saying, that the idea that your sectarian or your religious affiliation means nothing. These are Muslim Zionist regimes, equally, if not more Zionist than the state of Israel itself. They could care less. Whether the oppression is happening of Muslims, Christians, or whoever. So, in one sense, I always say this: that look, what's going on now is good. It's revealing that there's nothing. This is all nonsense. That there's some type of a brotherhood between kind of either the Muslims or the Christian or this or that or the Jew. No, it's not. It's what are your principles? What are your values? What is your ideological orientation? These are the questions that need to be asked. And I'm so glad that you went over that. Now, I can't leave Lebanon just before mentioning because one was and I said it deliberately. I also, of course, agree with you. The Orientalist cliche del Paris of the Middle East. This Orientalism that we, the auto-Orientalism that we often engage in. But the other issue is, of course, of that group designated as a terrorist organization known as Hezbollah. People we know about it in Pakistan and throughout the Muslim world. But we also then hear a narrative about it all the time, that it is kind of a very non-state militant kind of a terrorist outfit that just does what it wants, doesn't follow any rules, will attack Israel when it wants, etc. I mean, so there's a whole narrative and a propaganda that around Hezbollah. And I just wanted you to speak to that.
Well, thank you for that. Several points that you raised, and I think it's critical for people that use the word terrorist to understand what it means. Using the US legal code definition of terrorism, terrorism is any act of aggression intended to attack or coerce a civilian population in order to get a change in governmental policy.
Yes.
So anytime we commit an act of aggression or coercion against civilians in order to change governmental policy, that becomes an act of terrorism. That, by definition, is United States foreign policy. By definition, it is the United States foreign policy, be it the US foreign policy against Syria right now with the US Caesar Act, be it with the sanctions against Venezuela. You know, let us not forget the sanctions against Venezuela, against the democratically elected leader in Venezuela, and ongoing. I mean, the way the US government treats us in this region is no exception to the way it treats everybody else. And I wish we were special. But we're all equally oppressed, you know, by this global settler state racist colony called the United States. Okay, so just to put that into perspective as to what the word terrorist means. Now, what is Hezbollah? Hezbollah is an organization that was founded in response to the occupation of southern Lebanon by the Israeli military. It was not the first organization that has fought against Israeli occupation. The resistance against Israeli occupation in this region actually began before the State of Israel was created. It began in the 30s with people in Lebanon going to fight in Palestine because we saw what was happening, okay? We had the Communist Party, the Lebanese Communist Party, which, by the way, is the oldest political party in Lebanon, working together with the Syrian Social Nationalist Party, working together with the Palestinian Front for the Liberation of Palestine. They were all working together in different ways to as resistance against the Israeli occupation of Beirut, the Israeli occupation of the south, okay? Hezbollah then grew due to various political factors, some national, some regional, as the main resistance. But let us understand, it was born from that cry, okay?
Right.
And yes, Hezbollah in many ways is a non-state actor when it comes to its relationship in resistance. Its decisions to act in Lebanon, in Syria, etc. Okay, but it is also a political party. It is also an elected political party in Lebanon. Okay, so we have it. We have these different aspects of it. Yes, it has created and built arguably the largest, most effective fighting force in Lebanon, if not in the region. It has proven its military prowess against Israel like no other. It has extraordinary fighting skills and fighting maneuvers. And because of that ability, since 2006, Israel has not attacked Lebanon. Let us be very clear. Israel used to attack us quite regularly. Since 2006, it has not. But when we look at the word resistance, and here is where we need to be very critical. When a people resist, they resist because the state has failed. Right. When the state exists, there is no need for the people to resist. The question becomes then, when Israel committed the massacre in 1948 in Hula in Lebanon, where was the Lebanese state? When Israel attacked the planes, Middle East Airlines, in the Lebanese airport in 1968 and destroyed our fleet of airplanes, where was the Lebanese state? When Israel invaded and occupied and attacked, etc., on and on, where was the Lebanese state? Where was these political decisions? Where was the political courage to actually arm the Lebanese army so we can have an army that is equipped militarily to defend and to attack? Because attacking is a means of defense. Where is that? Rather, we have had consecutive governments in Lebanon make the decision not to build an army, make the decision to allow someone else, and thereby arises resistance. So here is for us that want to actually build a state. We want to reach a state, we want to reach a situation, a time period where our army is strong, militarily and politically, where our army then has the strength and the capabilities to defend all the Lebanese territories with no exception, and to take the decision, if we decide to do it, to attack. Right. But we are not at that stage now. But that is where we need to go.
Although, of course, not a Sisi's army.
No, a real army. Okay, but of course not the Sisi's army that serves to attack its individuals. For that army to exist, of course, Hezbollah, we need to conduct negotiations with Hezbollah for those weapons to then be under one unifying force. But for that to happen, we need to step out of a sectarian political system and step into a civil state, and one that uniformly recognizes Israel as an enemy. So it becomes within all of this rubric that we need to look at. We need to look at Hezbollah.
Rania,
unfortunately, politically speaking, domestically speaking,
I'm so glad you mentioned 2006 because, and you've referred to that a few times, because I don't think many people recognize how important that was in the long durée of the conflict with the Zionist entity in terms of the within the Arab world. I mean, when you are told by your various authoritarian dictatorial leaders, and who barely put up a fight or don't even want to fight, or so on and so forth, and have loss after loss after loss. So there's a psychological kind of imposition on the people that, look, that this is an invincible country that we cannot put up any resistance to. So I think it's wonderful that you keep on mentioning 2006, because it was truly a turning point, I think, in the story.
But it wasn't just 2006. For us, it was also May 2000, when most of our lands were liberated. You know, when the Israeli army literally ran away. Okay. It was also in 1983 when Beirut was liberated. We have many, many examples of victory. And I think it's important for us to recognize this, exactly as you stated, for us to shift the narrative. Many times we as colonized peoples, as oppressed peoples, we accept the idea that we are weak, and therefore we seek the shelter of the shade. You know, we have this expression in Arabic, you know, I will walk by the wall so that you will not target me, because I accept your idea that I am weak. But if we truly acknowledge that we can be strong, and we can be dignified, and we can be powerful, it changes so much. If we allow ourselves to imagine a different form of government, a different form of a nation, a different form of an economy, a different form of justice amongst ourselves, therein becomes a real liberation. And I think that remains one of our biggest challenges, is how to shift that narrative. Many a time when we talk about Palestine, people tell us it's a dream. It's a dream. You're dreaming that the Palestinian refugees will get to go home. You know, I'm sorry, but the slaves in the United States dreamt of liberty, and they achieved that liberty.
Yes.
The people in South Africa dreamt of freedom from political apartheid, and they achieved that freedom. The struggle is ongoing in the United States. The struggle is ongoing in South Africa. But we must also allow ourselves to dream, and we must also envision that victory and work towards it. Work towards the real liberation of our lands and the return of our peoples to our villages.
Absolutely. Wonderful, Rania. My final question for you, Rania, and this is a very kind of a honest assessment that you can give us after such a powerful message that I probably should have ended on, because it was just so moving. But I did want you to kind of give an honest assessment of kind of the state of the Palestine solidarity movement internationally. As you're probably much more aware than even I am, I mean, within various countries, you have seen the growth of these types of solidarity movements, from South Africa to the US to England, etc., where I was also involved in some of these organizations, and of course the accompanying BDS movement, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, where, and in light of kind of developments, I mean, the thing that strikes me is that with the growth of this kind of Palestine solidarity movement, on the ground within Palestine, are we actually seeing anything getting better, or actually even worse with things happening? But putting that aside, I just really want you to give an honest assessment of kind of where it's going, and perhaps some words of wisdom of like, you know, what are the tactics and strategies that at this point are necessary for the liberation of Palestine?
I very much appreciate the question, and I appreciate the tonality of the question. Yes, we are living in extraordinarily difficult times. There's no question. The ethnic cleansing of Palestine continues. It has continued since 1948. The home demolitions have increased this year at a faster rate than they were last year. The level of children that are detained is continuing to increase. And I would argue that many of us have reached a kind of numbness when we read about the horrors inflicted on Palestinians in Gaza, or the horrors inflicted on Palestinians in the West Bank or in Jerusalem, you know, and then we seem to forget about the Palestinians within 1948 Palestine. And we seem to forget about the Palestinian refugees in camps in Lebanon and elsewhere. Yes, let us not for 1 second think that this year is better than last year. The situation is much more difficult. And when you add onto it another layer, which is the Palestinian Authority itself, and the creation of this authority, which I compare to the Versailles government when France was occupied by Germany. The Palestinian Authority is basically the Versailles government coupled with the globalization of non-governmental organizations, because we've had both of these things happen. The Palestinian Authority, which serves as a security coordination and with the enemy, with the occupier.
Just for our viewers, like a collaborationist government, right?
Yes, completely a collaborationist government, not like one. It is a collaborationist government.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and you add on to that this creation of non-governmental organizations, particularly in the West Bank, that then do what? And they serve particular needs, but who are they beholden to? Who do they return to? And so here we cannot look at the struggle and the challenges without examining an added layer of a challenge, which is the money from the Gulf. All of this oil Gulf money that has been used for decades, okay, within the Palestinian Authority, within these non-governmental organizations, within other aid agencies, what will be the impact then on the mere survivability of the people? Here, we're not even talking about the struggle. We're talking about people's livelihoods. So the challenges are quite intense. Now, you add on to all of this open normalization between the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, and soon to follow Sudan, Oman, Saudi Arabia, and others, and the repercussions that this will have on academic collaborations, cultural collaborations, military collaborations. All of this is a flood. You add onto it another layer, which we cannot dismiss, which is this marriage of values between the Israeli government and the Indian government. And the repercussions that has, not only on India, but the repercussions that has throughout the subcontinent, which are quite severe.
And I'll point to you, Rania, that what is happening in Kashmir right now, it is a parallel model that is now being implemented. It was slowly being implemented before, but right now it is almost a carbon copy of what's going on in terms of terms of changing the demographics of the area, bringing in settlers and so on. So absolutely, absolutely what you're saying.
Exactly. And we cannot dismiss the horror that is happening in Kashmir, nor can we dismiss all the lessons that the Israeli apartheid regime have learned by oppressing and killing Palestinians, and the way they are then taking these lessons to the border between Mexico and the United States, and they are imposing those lessons there, as well as taking those lessons to US police departments. Goodness knows where else they are taking those lessons to. The other marriage of values that we have yet to uncover that is happening around the world. So the challenges are quite intense.
Yes.
There is another layer of challenge which we cannot dismiss, which is when we think about globalization. Now, how are we communicating with each other? Through a technology.
Right.
But many technologies that are being used right now for communication, for organizing, such as Facebook, such as Zoom, such as YouTube, such as WhatsApp, all of these are controlled by individuals who are beholden to the Israeli government and recently have accepted the censorship of the revolutionary Leila Khalid and denied her presence on Zoom and on YouTube and on Facebook. Okay,
that's right.
So with that happening, we can expect further censorships of further voices, not simply Palestinian voices. Goodness knows who else will be censored. Okay, so what else in terms of our means of communication will be limited in our ability to organize and to communicate and to connect with each other? The challenges are huge, okay? And we need to organize in response to these challenges. We need to be building different technological platforms. We need to be building more solidarity amongst ourselves as communities seeking liberation, okay? And to recognize that we are really in this together. You know, I wish we were the only ones being occupied. I wish we were the only ones being oppressed. Unfortunately, that's not the case. So let us also learn from the struggles of the First Nation communities in the United States, the ongoing struggle of the First Nation communities in Canada, by the way, where they're still suffering a great deal. And we don't think about Canada as a settler states colony, but it is as well, you know.
It's the nicer face of North America, right?
Yes, exactly.
Right.
Connect those all together, okay? Now, I'm sure you want some good news. And the good news is, I'll give you just a sliver. Despite all of this, they recently passed a boycott, divestment, and sanctions referendum in Columbia University. The University of Columbia, after years of struggle, passed a very strong referendum. These are pockets of hope, okay?
Right.
We still have, you know, a very strong cry from Palestinian generations, despite it all, okay, that are still holding on to the land and still holding on to their identity. And this is important. This is important. We see this in Palestine. We see this in the occupied Golan Heights. We see this. So then the question for us as organizers is, how can we strengthen it? How can we strengthen the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement? How can we strengthen our narrative so we are not beholden to this, well, let's speak to both sides nonsense, you know, or let us accept this nonsense of a two-state solution.
Which is becoming so popular, and has co-opted so many Muslim organizations and so on and so forth. Absolutely. You're absolutely right.
And thank you for bringing that up. How do we also reject the narrative that this is a Muslim struggle against Judaism?
Right.
Because this is not a struggle for Muslims. This is a struggle for all of us who believe in equality, irrespective of our religion, okay?
Right.
Those that are occupying Palestine, they claim to be doing it in the name of Judaism, but they are also an affront to Judaism. They are also an insult to Judaism. So let us make sure that we recognize Israel for what it is, a settler state colony that is using religion. So let us not fall into the trap of trying to liberate our lands through the lens of religion, but rather through the lens of real liberatory struggles.
Absolutely.
We're still here. We're still fighting the fight. And, you know, for me, the issue is not one of hope. Honestly, for me, the issue is one of responsibility. And are we responsible for our people? Are we responsible for our land? Are we responsible for our dignity? And if the answer is yes, then how can we build more effective strategies?
Absolutely. Wonderful, wonderful, Rania. I'm so sorry we are out of time, but this was an absolutely phenomenal conversation with you that I was really excited to have. Again, folks, Dr. Rania Masri, my dear friend Rania, and I'm so glad that we were actually able to get her to here to Pakistan virtually, but actually, as I told Rania, our viewership now is pretty global. So we really do thank you for coming, and the insights that I can assure you we would probably not get from anywhere else. So thank you so much, Rania, for coming.
Thank you very much for the space and for your openness. Thank you very much. All the best
Thanks,
to you
Rania.
all.
All right, you too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.